Good evening and welcome to Bookmark. Last time I closed with a suggestion that we should install ACs. Well, I was running short of time, so I didn't have time to point out that that is actually not a solution. It has been pointed out by someone. Why is it not a solution? It's a kind of catch-22 situation. If you do certain things to escape from global warming, you will actually make the problem worse, and that is the case with ACs. There was another thing I wanted to point out, which is this. In California, and remember, Californians are people who think that they're ahead of everyone else in the world. California boasts of being the place where the future happens first. Well, in California, there's this old saying that when a foreigner asked a Californian, "So what are you going to do about global warming?" The Californian is supposed to have replied, "Well, if the temperature goes up 1 degree, I'll turn my AC up so that it takes care of 1 degree of cooling." Now, there is something very smug and self-satisfied about this answer, and it is not typical of Californians. It is typical of affluent people across the world, including here in Kerala and in India. And I wanted to point out that that is actually one of the problems that we are facing. So much for ACs and global warming. I would also like to point out that since we met last, in the 2 weeks since we had the last episode, there have been major fires in Italy, Greece, and of all places, Hawaii. Hawaii was a tropical paradise, but a large part of one of the important islands has burned down. Now, it was reported that in Greece, when reporters asked locals about the fires, they were unhappy about the fires, but they refused to link it to global warming. Indeed, they were furious at the suggestion that there was a connection. But the natives of Hawaii acknowledged that global warming was a huge factor in the fire that they had. They also said that the fact that they had ruined their land by importing non-native species, particularly of trees and grass, which dried up in the drought and then provided fuel for the fire, added to the problem. Now, there is even more irony here than there was in the AC situation. And what is the irony? The irony is that the natives of the Pacific Islands were the ones who were more skeptical about the notion of cause and effect being linked, paternity. Now they understand that these fires are caused by global warming. But the Europeans, the land from which the anthropologists went to the Pacific and wondered at why the natives couldn't understand the notion of paternity, couldn't understand cause and effect, they are the ones who seem to be suffering from the same problem. So once again, you have irony. This time, we are going to look at a book on trees. But before I do that, something by note of apology. There have been a huge number of books on trees, so much so that people remark that several forests must have been cut down to print these books on trees. I'm afraid that there is some weight in that argument, except that some of these guys make sure to print on their books that it is being printed on recycled paper. I haven't checked the books I have, but perhaps, they're also adding to the problem. But there are some really wonderful books on trees, and I'm going to introduce 4 or 5 of them. Number 1 is this book. It is titled The Emerald Planet: How Plants Changed Earth's History. It is by a gentleman called David Beerley, and it came out in 2007. The second of the books I'm going to recommend is The Songs of Trees: Stories from Nature's Great Connectors, and it is by David George Haskell. It's fairly recent. Haskell's book actually came out in 2018, which brings me to the third book I want to introduce. It's a fabulous work. It is titled Finding the Mother Tree: Uncovering the Wisdom and Intelligence of the Forest, and is by a remarkable lady called Susan Simard. This book probably deserves an episode on its own, but I will close by saying extremely strongly recommend. The fourth book I want to recommend is a book titled Lab Girl by a lady named Hope Jackran. Extremely strongly recommended. It is as much on science as it is on trees. Jackson is a paleobotanist who's worked in different parts of the world, and it is a truly gripping book, both on the nature of plants and trees and on the nature of science and how difficult it is to be a scientist in the contemporary world. Which brings me to the book of the day. It is this one, The Nation of Plants by Stefano Mancuso. Mancuso is an Italian life scientist, and he writes brilliantly about plants and trees. And I picked this book because for sheer beauty, for sheer power of his argument, and for the amount of space he's taken, just around 150 or 200 pages, it's a remarkable work, a work that I would like everyone to read. What does Mancuso do in this book? We have to exercise our imagination and imagine that trees are not just unmoving, senseless objects that are to be found in the landscape, but let us think of them as being capable of feeling, responding, reacting, communicating, and sometimes even thinking. Now that seems very, very strange, but Mancuso will convince you, as indeed Susan Simard and Jackson and some of the others who write about this subject will convince you, that trees can actually do all of these things. There's only one thing that's a problem. They do it at a scale that is far, far slower than that to which we are accustomed. We as humans and animals are used to doing this very quickly. Trees do this, but they do it very slowly, and they do it in a manner which we can't easily discern. But these are scientists who have tried and succeeded in discerning some of this. So if trees are capable of thinking and acting and reacting, there is a suggestion that they're ethical beings. Let us exercise our imagination and accept that they're ethical beings. In that case, says Mancuso, we have to grant them one thing. We have to grant them certain political rights. We imagine that the only people with political rights are Homo sapiens, and then we divide ourselves into groups based on nationality or religion or geography, and we quarrel about our political rights. Imagine trees being a nation. That's what the title says. And imagine those trees having political rights. Imagine a representative of those trees talking to us about their political rights. That is what Mancuso does in his book. He's a very effective spokesperson, a sort of representative of the trees. And the book is divided into chapters, each of which is an article of belief for the nation of trees. All right? There are 8 of these articles, and after the 8th article, there is a chapter or a small chapter, an epilogue, where the representative of the trees speaks to the head of the United Nations and to the General Assembly in the United Nations about the rights that trees have. If trees are a nation, they would easily be the most powerful nation in the world. Why? They would easily outnumber human beings. Indeed, human beings form a minuscule in terms of numbers or in terms of mass. They just cannot compete with the trees. So if you're genuinely democratic, you will have to admit that the trees outnumber us and therefore they have greater rights. This is a democracy. If you're not a democrat but are an aristocrat, he says we still have to yield to the trees. Why do we have to yield to the trees? Aristocracy is based on the idea that the best should rule. We, Homo sapiens, have arrogated to ourselves the right to call ourselves the best because we think we have the biggest brains, we are the ones who have turned the world around, and we are masters, or so we think, of the earth. But Mancuso has a different argument which goes back to Darwin. He says that if we are to use a different criteria to measure fitness, then trees are fitter than human beings. And what is the criteria? The ability to last. trees not only made possible all animal life on earth, but if the trees are to disappear, so would all animal life on earth. End of argument. Who is the fittest to be on earth? Trees. And therefore, the rights of the trees have to be recognized. So that is what Mancuso is telling us. Believe me, he may have his tongue in cheek, but it is still a very convincing argument. Now, he says if you look at the world of trees, one of the things you will notice is that there is a wonderful example of symbiosis. From moss to the biggest trees, he just calls them plants. And if you look at the world of plants, they exist helping each other. We like to believe that evolution is all about competition and killing each other to survive. And that, Mancuso convinces us, is a misreading of Darwin. Why is it a misreading of Darwin? It is a misreading of Darwin because Darwin never said anything about the survival of the fittest. That is not his phrase. It came from one of his admirers. Indeed, if you read Darwin, what he says is that nature establishes a balance and it is about mutual help. Species help each other to survive. And if that spirit, which is the spirit of trees and plants, is taken up by man as well, then maybe we will have a better future than we appear to have. He gives us some examples, not too many examples, but some examples from what has happened in the recent past to show how stupid and foolish man can be, primarily because of his arrogance. I will narrate one of those. In China, under Mao Zedong, there was a famous Great Leap Forward. And one of the things that Mao wanted to do in the Great Leap Forward was to increase the amount of food that they produced. The Chinese scientists and Mao together identified 4 pests which they said was responsible for eating so much food that the Chinese people could not always benefit from the harvest that they had managed to get. They were rats, mosquitoes, flies and sparrows. And Mao declared a war on all these. The war was taken up so enthusiastically by Chinese that practically every sparrow, and remember there were millions of sparrows at the time in China, were killed because sparrows would eat grains which had ripened on rice fields or wheat fields or barley fields. They were killed or wiped out. What was the result? For 3 or 4 years after that event, after they were tried to be wiped out, Chinese harvests were almost entirely destroyed by locusts because the natural predator which the locust had, which was a sparrow, had disappeared. 20 million to 40 million people are estimated to have died in the great Chinese famines, caused by a good intention, but then we know that the path to hell is often paved with good intentions. So for Mancuso, Mao is a very good example of what an arrogant and ignorant man will do. I know that there are people in our country who revere Mao and think that he did all this out of the compassion of his heart for the poor people. Maybe they are right, but they should also do well to remember that of the 20 to 40 million people who died in China, almost all of them were poor. Mancuso closes his book with an epilogue where he addresses the UN General Assembly, or rather a representative of the plants addresses the UN General Assembly. I'll read 2 short quotations so that you understand what they say. 1, we have sustained animal life, including yours, ever since the beginning. Who is we? Plants. The planet that we inhabit is alive because we are here. Water, oxygen, the climate depend on us. We are the engine of life. Be conscious of that. The second quotation is this. If you would dedicate to plant research just 1/10 of what you spend on technology research, you would be saved. Up to now, you have preferred to do otherwise. Change now. We can teach you how to obtain energy from the sun, how to depopulate our only planet, depollute our only planet, returning it to its ancient wonder, how to create organizations that are more democratic, decentralized, strong, and with which to face a future that you are now afraid of. So this tells us the spirit of the address that they make to the United Nations, and an address to the United Nations is an address to each one of us. I must end on a sad note. The number of people on earth who hate plants is much bigger than the number of people on earth who love plants. And that is a huge problem, because in the battle between those who hate trees and plants and those who love them, the haters are winning. The haters are driven mostly by greed, love of money, and sometimes just by malice and hatred for life. They are the ones who will cut down trees, and they prefer concrete to natural life. They are also the ones who will uproot or cut trees, which for them are terrible things. So in this unequal battle, and it is an unequal battle, for example, in my hometown of Trivandrum, I know how many trees we are losing. There are some good people, forces like Friends of the Trees, who try to fight them, but it is a very unequal battle. But let us join this battle. Let us fight for plants and trees, because this is a just cause. Not just a just cause, probably the most important cause in the world. Let us, as Mancuso says, fill every possible place on earth, whether it is a city or a rural land. He says, fill every place with plants, suitable plants. On that rather green note, goodbye and thank you very much for watching.